Gentlemen, and welcome once again to a session in the symposium sponsored jointly by the University of Richmond and the Education and the Holocaust Education Committee of the Virginia-Israel Commission. The title of our symposium, The Holocaust as History, the Future of Memory. This evening, we are both privileged and fortunate to have with us a gentleman and a scholar who has established credentials as one of, if not the, leading authority in the English-speaking world on the general subject of the Holocaust and its place in history. Professor Michael R. Marrus, who is currently Professor of History at the University of Toronto in Canada. Professor Marrus received his undergraduate education at the University of Toronto, his graduate training at the University of California at Berkeley, and has pursued in the intervening years a distinguished career as a teacher and scholar on 3 continents. He's taught in the United States and Canada, at St. Anthony's College at Oxford, and at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His books, which include The Unwanted, European Refugees in the 20th Century, which won a Present Tense Book Award, Vichy France and the Jews, which he co-authored with Professor Robert O. Paxton, which also won an award, and most recently, his book, The Holocaust in History, copies of which are available in the lobby for those of you who may be interested. All have been uniform in the quality of their research and the caliber of their elegant literary style and writing. Most recently, he was kind enough to send to me in the mail one of his less strenuous efforts, an article of fascinating detail on the fate of Herschel Grinspan, the young Polish Jew whose assassination of the German diplomat Ernst von Roth in Paris in November of 1938 touched off the chain of events that that led to the justification for the Reichskristallnacht in Germany. Professor Marrus is here this evening to speak to us on the subject of the Holocaust in history. Professor Marrus.
Thank you very much, President Sidnor. In the very brief time in which I've been in this state, I've appreciated the courtesy and the hospitality with which I've been received. I'm very proud as well to be the guest of the Virginia-Israel Committee and to participate in this symposium. I want to speak this evening about my sense of the direction that the study of the Holocaust has taken in recent times. I want to begin by observing that Holocaust history seems to be firmly set in the academic landscape. This has not always been the case, and no one knows it better than the Dean of Holocaust historians, Raoul Hilberg. There are no longer reasonable grounds to deny its place in academic history, Hilberg observed recently, as certainly there was when he began his voluminous and monumental study of the subject in the immediate post-war years. The foreboding of Lucy Davidovitz, repeated just a few years ago, that the history of the 6 million Jews would vanish from the face of the earth as they themselves and their civilization have vanished, this view appears today to be oddly dated and uninformed, a perception rooted, I think, in the American climate of the 1960s rather than the current realities of research and professional writing. But the problem now, as Hilberg reflected recently in a survey of historical approaches to the Holocaust, is that, to quote him, the Jewish catastrophe may be perceived as an event standing alone. Now that is the issue that I want to address this evening, and I want to draw on a number of concrete examples in order to do so. In my view, a lack of communication with related fields of inquiry utterly outside the field of Jewish history poses serious limits to scholarly writing on the Holocaust today. Understandably, perhaps, Jewish writers have encouraged a separation of the study of the Holocaust from the history of our own time by emphasizing the uniqueness of the Holocaust and the special difficulties that study about it poses both for historians and for others. In his thoughtful assessment of Holocaust literature, for example, Alvin Rosenfeld speaks of the deep anguish and the immense frustration of the writer who confronts a subject that belittles and threatens to overwhelm the resources of language. Shaul Friedlander refers similarly to the historian's paralysis before the Holocaust in its largest sense, arguing that the profound dynamics of the problem still evade us. Academics have sometimes hesitated to pursue the subject, apprehensive that it precluded the objectivity and detachment that they take to be part of their scholarly vocation. Many might agree with survivors who have complained of a tendency to universalize the Holocaust and to make easier the writing about it. Another much discussed pitfall is trivialization, sometimes considered a result of prurient media attention, but also the product of promiscuous interest in the subject. Any writer may, if he so chooses, deal with the subject of the Holocaust, Elie Wiesel complained in the New York Times in 1983. His task, he declared then, was to insist on the limits of understanding of the subject, a posture more likely to induce paralysis among serious writers than creative investigation and critical examination. Robert Alter, a man of very different views, nevertheless shared Wiesel's distrust of academic treatments, one result of which was, to quote Alter, naturalizing the horror by making it part of the curriculum, unquote. Citing the Israeli historian Yehuda Bauer, Alter deplored the ease with which you can describe murder and then turn it into a seminar paper. Now, while cognizant of this pitfall, I want to suggest, in contrast, ways in which our understanding of the Holocaust can improve and not suffer by seeing it academically in the context of its time. Let me stress, however, that I deal with a particular kind of understanding loosely called historical. I refer to the kind of comprehension that most of us might seek about such historical themes as the French Revolution, the First World War, or British imperialism. Now, whatever it was, the Nazi Holocaust was a historical reality like any of these, and it deserves to be understood like them, using similar tools and similarly appropriate contextual reference points. Of course, this is a limited exercise, restricted to the kinds of questions that historians usually ask. Not how could human beings do such things, but how did certain people at particular times do what they did? Not why did some people fail to act as we would like them to have done, but rather what was in their minds then and on similar occasions. And to be sure, there are other kinds of understanding and other questions and other disciplines in which these are pursued. Historical understanding is of central importance, however, for upon it, most of the rest of the edifice of knowledge and belief will ultimately be built. Examinations of the origins of the final solution have particularly benefited of late from a concern to see Nazi policy towards the Jews within its wartime historical framework. Against the widely held view of Lucy Davidovitz that war in Europe provided Hitler with a cover for his long-intended goal of extermination of European Jewry, many historians now emphasize the evolution of Nazi policy and its transformation into a pan-European murderous objective only in the course of the Russian campaign of the latter half of 1941. Given that German strategists anticipated a quick success to their blitzkrieg against Poland in 1939, it is striking that the Polish campaign included no plans to deal with the soon-to-be incorporated Jews. The evidence suggests a lack of preparation and a process of experimentation following the German victory, as the Nazis groped towards their goal of ridding the expanded Reich of its Jews. Notably, the Nazis continued for the next 2 years to press for Jewish emigration from Nazi-dominated Europe. Hardly a reasonable policy if their perceived intention was already to murder each and every Jew they could find within their grasp. It is now clear that German policymakers were engaged since 1939 in colossal plans to alter the demography of Eastern Europe. Schemes involving the uprooting of literally millions of people in order to carve out the Lebensraum that Hitler had for so long set as the goal of the Third Reich. Broadly speaking, many hundreds of thousands of inhabitants of newly conquered territories were to be uprooted and driven to the east, making way for huge numbers of ethnic Germans, or Volksdeutsche, who were to be brought home, as the Nazis said, and settled in their place. As with the final solution, Himmler was put in charge. And as with the massacre of European Jewry, the process was to involve the deaths of countless numbers of non-Aryan peoples. Ethnic mush, as one planning document put it. This vast and in some respects genocidal undertaking, plotted within a specifically structured branch of the SS, conditioned Nazi officials to think in terms of the most grandiose solutions and the most ruthless disregard for human life. Add to this the euphoric mood of the Barbarossa campaign against the Soviet Union, launched in June 1941 with utopian appeals not only to the massacre of Jews, but also to the most indiscriminate destruction of Soviet society. And one has some sense of the circumstances that facilitated the systematic European-wide killing of Jews and precipitated the decision to begin the murderous operations. Recent research has pointed out as well how other Nazi policies, originally having nothing to do with the Jews, contributed to the escalation of Nazi anti-Semitism to a decision for comprehensive mass murder. We have known for a long time that the organizers and technicians of the so-called euthanasia program, responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of physically and mentally handicapped Germans, transferred their specialties to the murder of Jews once the final solution was underway. The Israeli researcher Yitzhak Arad has calculated several score of such personnel who worked the killing centers of Operation Reinhard, the massacre of Jews of the Polish Generalgouvernement beginning in the spring of 1942. Going further, the psychoanalyst Robert J. Lifton has suggested that the rationale of what he calls medicalized killing, the elimination of what the Nazis termed life unworthy of life, contributed to the evolution of what he calls a genocidal mentality during the course of the war. Nazi genocide seems not to have been the end result of a clear, long-standing plan, but rather to have evolved from a shared imagery in the minds of Nazi leaders, according to Lifton. Part of this imagery, in his view, was the medically sanctioned perception of a society as an organism that had to be cured of its ills. National Socialism itself, in one common formulation, was nothing more than applied biology, bringing radical therapy to a sick society. Murder came easily to the Nazis, as we know. By the beginning of the Barbarossa campaign, this medicalized killing accounted for between 80 and 100,000 victims, and possibly more. Restraints gradually fell away as the program expanded and the resolution of those in charge hardened. Thereafter, the techniques, the bureaucratic structures, and much of the ideological underpinning for mass murder transferred to places like Auschwitz and the death camps of the Generalgouvernement. One way to look at the Holocaust, according to Lifton, is to see mass murder as a vision of a total cure, a vision obsessed with fears of pollution and defilement, and galvanized by an urge for purification. Drawing on our knowledge of Nazi occupation policies and the responses of conquered peoples to the conditions of defeat and domination by the Germans, it is possible to make some sense of the widespread assistance that the Nazis secured across Europe in carrying out the final solution. Except in Poland and the Soviet Union, where the Nazis' brutality was undisguised and their power practically unlimited, the Germans moved cautiously to implement their anti-Jewish plans. Wherever possible, the occupiers preferred to have local authorities shoulder the burdens of persecution and suffer whatever opposition existed to the elimination of the Jews. German occupation officials had an astute perception of local sensibilities and took great care to draw indigenous forces into their anti-Jewish task. Anti-Jewish propaganda existed everywhere and reinforced both pre-existing antipathies and also a tendency to blame outsiders for those who were perceived to be such for local and national calamities. In each country, there is an important story to be told of how local conditions facilitated the Hitlerian program. France is a case in point, and one in which I have worked to some degree. The Jewish experience in that country can only be understood within the framework of extensive support the Germans received from the French in the vast and complex process of identifying Jews, isolating them in French society, interning them in special camps, and finally deporting them to the Auschwitz death camp. The government of Vichy, the collaborationist government of Pétain and Laval, not only provided police to round up the Jews and trainmen to carry them on their last journey, but also built up, during the 2 years preceding deportations, an elaborate network of laws, ordinances, and regulations that made the final steps possible. Significantly, historians have found no trace at all, of a German diktat in the early period, no German direction to move against the Jews. The explanation for French complicity lies in an appreciation of previously active anti-Jewish passions, local reactions to the disastrous events of 1940, the defeat of France, and the collaborationist strategies that emerged from those circumstances. Stunned by the catastrophe that had so suddenly engulfed their society, the overwhelming majority of Frenchmen deferred to the aged war hero Marshal Philippe Pétain, prepared to yield both their liberties and their judgment to an authoritarian, highly nationalistic regime. In the wake of a catastrophic defeat, a small group of French politicians moved quickly to launch the National Revolution, as it was called, under the aegis of Pétain, the new head of state. This national revolution was a vast and ambitious project for the renovation of French society, remaking it in a new image, healthier, stronger, and to varying degrees attracted by what a historian has recently referred to as the magnetic field of European fascism. Determined French anti-Semites, hitherto a relatively small voice in French politics, now persuaded their colleagues that an anti-Jewish policy would be in the national interest, and not only demonstrating goodwill to the German occupier, but also preempting the latter from introducing his own anti-Semitic program. Designed to reduce the place of the Jews in French society and not to murder them, Vichy's persecution was also intended to promote French, as opposed to German, national interests. The Nazis, it is now clear, had very little to do with the National Revolution or its anti-Semitism. The Germans let the French spin their elaborate projects for a French Renaissance, insisting only that Vichy submit to staggering occupation costs and accept the humiliating division of their country. It was only in the summer of 1942, 2 years after the French defeat, when the tentacles of the final solution reached out to Western Europe and that the bullying of the French began. But by that point, much of the destructive work had already been done. The laws in place had snapped many of the links that bound the Jews to French society, making it easier to round them up and deport them to the east. During the next 3 years, the Germans set stringent deportation quotas and relied on French assistance to accomplish their task. French participation in the anti-Jewish project was by this time suffering from a distinct loss of enthusiasm. Significant damage had already been done, however, and the roundup and deportation of Jews was made far easier than it would have been otherwise. Now, across Europe, the plight of Jews in Nazi-occupied Poland should be understood differently, not only against the background of long-standing popular antipathy towards Jews, but also within the particular geopolitical framework of Eastern Europe. In the first place, as the Israeli historian Ezra Mendelsohn has pointed out recently, Jews in interwar Poland were themselves divided on the nature of Polish anti-Semitism. Many Jews preferred to see their difficulties as emanating from the concrete circumstances of a highly threatened society, in which other groups besides the Jews, notably the Germans and Ukrainians, were also the targets of intense hostilities. Certainly not every Jew interpreted his situation as part of an indigenous, endemic, long-standing, deeply ingrained Polish anti-Semitism. The particular occupation conditions, however, and the terrible suffering of the Polish population stimulated a revival of the latent anti-Jewish feeling which did exist in that country, and also prompted a major clash of interests that divided Jews and Poles. From a very early point in their occupation, the Nazis began to expel Jews from the Polish economy and to isolate them in urban ghettos. In many localities, Jews and Poles communicated almost exclusively by smuggling, hardly an activity conducive to mutual understanding. Within the Polish underground, moreover, hostility towards the Jews derived, at least in part, from Polish fears that the Jews were in league with the Soviets, joining other national minorities to prevent the restoration of Polish independence and national integrity. The Polish Home Army, or Armia Krajowa, had understandable, though utterly exaggerated, fears of communist influence within the Jewish resistance in Warsaw, and had a completely different strategic objective from that of the Jews. The Home Army saw its task as the preservation of the Polish nation against Nazi depredations and the preparation of liberation under the most propitious circumstances. One of its important concerns, therefore, was to prevent what they called premature uprisings that would cost the population dearly and would weaken resistance forces unnecessarily. For the Jews, of course, the term premature was infused with bitter irony. The Jewish underground increasingly realized that the Jews would not survive the war, would not survive at all. And finally, the Jewish underground decided to lash out at its tormentors, even at the cost of what remained of the Jewish communities. These circumstances, it is now suggested, help explain, along with the latent anti-Semitism in Poland, the failure of the Polish underground to extend significant aid to the Jewish uprising in Warsaw in the spring of 1943. So that is one other instance in which historical context broadens our explanatory framework. Historical context also helps us understand the widespread assistance that Jews received, a subject now under considerable study and investigation. Let me refer to two instances, Denmark and Italy. In both of these countries, anti-Semitism failed to take root for a variety of reasons. The lack of local anti-Jewish traditions, the small size of the Jewish communities, and the absence of large numbers of foreign Jews. But in each case, extraneous factors influenced the situation and permitted local sympathies to be mobilized for rescue activities. Under the best of circumstances, there was no love lost between the Italians and the Germans, with the former deeply suspicious of Nazi racial pretensions and the urge to dominate their junior Axis partner. When the Nazis spoke of the tall, blonde Aryans who would rule Europe, the Italians knew that the Nazis weren't talking about them. With the beginning of the final solution in territories under Italian control, the fascist troops were already weary of the war and unwilling to be drawn into the Germans' barbarities. For as long as the Italians maintained their independence of the Germans, fascist forces protected Jews, and not only in Italy itself, but wherever the Italians were in occupation, whether it be in parts of Greece or Croatia or France, and even here and there in Eastern Europe. For reasons that are still not entirely clear, Hitler refrained from pressing Mussolini on the matter, deferring to the Duce as he so often did on matters that he considered not to be especially urgent. In Denmark, a country that surrendered practically without firing a shot in 1940, the Germans permitted a wide degree of independence within what they considered their model protectorate. For 3 years, the Nazi occupation authorities hesitated to impose an anti-Jewish regime, preferring to wait before scooping up the relatively tiny group of 8,000 Jews that lived in that country. In the summer of 1943, however, Danish-German relations reached a crisis point, and both political and social conditions worsened rapidly. Moving suddenly, the Germans cracked down hard in Denmark and at the same time decided to seize the Jews who lived there. Under these circumstances, the Danes readily associated their humiliating subservience and the ruthless oppression of their country with the victimization of Jews. The two came together chronologically and came together late in the war. Timing, as well as geography, now facilitated a vast rescue operation. The German crackdown coincided with dramatic setbacks to the Reich. The disastrous German defeats at El Alamein, Stalingrad, and Kursk, and the beginning of a spectacular Allied air offensive against the German heartland. By the autumn of 1943, Hitler no longer seemed invincible, and resistance to him everywhere mobilized. For the Danes, the neutral haven of Sweden beckoned, needing only the crossing of a few miles of open water in the Zund between Copenhagen, where the Jews were concentrated, and the port of Malmö, where the Swedes were ready to receive them. Without wishing to disparage the selflessness and heroism involved in this extraordinary instance of rescue, it is well to note that without the important factors that I have mentioned, rescue could never have been possible on such a large scale, and indeed might not have occurred at all. Historical perspective is also crucial for an examination of the conduct of bystanders to the Holocaust, in illustration of which I have time to mention only one brief example. But here too, I want to stress, historical context helps to elucidate the understanding that we have of what transpired. There has been much discussion of the Allied failure in the summer of 1944 to take up the suggestion, so far as I can tell, originally made by Rabbi Dov Weissmandl of Bratislava, that the camp of Auschwitz or the railway approaches to it be bombed so as to impede the operation of the death machinery, then working overtime in the massacre of Hungarian Jewry, indeed murdering on the scale unthinkable previously of some 12,000 a day. Now, this issue of the proposal to bomb the approaches or the camp itself of Auschwitz is an extremely complex one, and I can only refer to it telegraphically here. But let me indicate some of these contextual reference points that I think are important and should be added to the to the explanatory apparatus. Suffice it to say that without denying the difficulties posed by the proposal, the technical difficulties, Professor David Wyman and others have demonstrated that start to look at contemporary events in the Middle East. My sense is that those events that you discussed are not significantly illuminated by a study of the Nazi Holocaust, the roots of which are profoundly sunk in Christian Europe and in the Nazi movement of the 1930s and 40s. Murderous regimes have existed since then, exist now, and will continue to exist in the future. I don't think that the tendency to explain all of them with reference to Nazism takes us very far, particularly when they come from very different cultures.
My intent was not to relate to Nazism. My intent was to relate to just the actions of that group of people with their same thoughts.
Well, I simply don't find it. I don't find that parallel. I'm sorry, sir. Yes, sir.
Let me ask you a the persecution of Jews, which ultimately ended in the final solution, as an evolutionary process by the German people and the people who were following them, but also by the German leadership. It seems to me that the leadership had a plan all set in advance from day one, as evidenced by the fact, for instance, that in 1935, Hitler already in Nuremberg spoke about the final solution if the Jews won't abide by the racial laws, and also by the conversation reported by Rauschen, in which Hitler was asked by the interviewer whether the persecution or killing of Jews will not arouse the hatred of the world against Germany, to which Hitler said, I'm not worried about it. The Turks killed the Armenians, and the world forget about it. We are going to kill the Jews, and the world will forget. And therefore, I think that the evolutionary process was only within the people, because the Nazis did not feel that the world was ready to kill many, many millions of people. So they wanted to slowly persecute the Jews, make the world feel that they are vermin, not people, and then, once they are oriented that way, plus a tremendous propaganda machine of the Germans, that made it possible to make the people to start murdering.
Okay, you've asked a very big question. Indeed, entire conferences have turned on this issue of the extent to which the Nazi leadership had clearly in mind a murderous final solution from a very early point in time. Charles Sidner is among a number of others that have looked at this matter in very great detail, and the subject is one of continuing debate. Let me divide my answer into two. First, referring to one of your distinctions between the Nazi leadership and the German public at large. You're entirely right to make that distinction, since we have now a series of close studies of German public opinion, both in the time before the Nazis took power, before January 1933, and also, interestingly, some studies of public opinion in the Third Reich. In brief, what these studies suggest is that while there was considerable anti-Jewish opinion in Germany, anti-Semitism was probably not one of the things that helped the Nazis in the Kampfzeit, as they called it, in the period before Hitler took power. Far more useful in his campaign, for example, was the campaign against the Treaty of Versailles. Far more useful was his campaign against Marxism and the German communists. So, anti-Semitism, yes, but I think we can observe, by the way, that there was far more anti-Semitism in countries like Romania, Poland, probably Hungary, than there was in pre-Nazi Germany, and even the Germany of Hitler himself. Widespread indifference is probably a much better term to frame German public opinion. There are considerable variations as between large cities, small town, country, rural, Catholic, Protestant, and I won't go into that. It is a complex picture. We don't find here a burning anti-Semitic commitment, therefore. We do, however, find that burning anti-Semitic commitment in the Nazi leadership. And here, I think you're directing attention properly to the core of the issue. And moreover, I think it fair to say that given what we know of the Nazi movement, the central importance of Hitler is unmistakable. Indeed, my own sense is that if Hitler had been killed, as indeed he might easily have been in 1923, in the attempted putsch, of that year, we would have had no final solution. We would have had, in all likelihood, a war. We might have had a Nazi takeover, but I don't think we would have had a murderous campaign against all of European Jewry. And it wouldn't have stopped there, by the way. So let me come to that. The unique and distinctive element of the final solution, it seems to me, is the hunting down of each and every Jew, wherever the Jew was to be found. Not just Jews who posed a threat, but the old, the sick, tiny infants, they were all to be hunted down, wherever they could be found. Now, the problem is to determine whether, the problem as you've posed it, is to determine whether this was a Nazi intention or a Hitlerian intention from a very early point. Some would even say 1919, when Hitler writes his first important anti-Semitic letter to a colleague in which he indicates his commitment to a I forget the exact German term, but it is for a decisive solution or of sorts, through whether that it is a decision taken at that time, whether it is a commitment evident in Mein Kampf, whether it is a commitment evident from his pre-war speeches, whether it is indicated in that speech that you cited in which Hitler says, "Who now remembers the Armenians?" This is a problem. The speech, by the way, in which Hitler refers to the Armenians is not a speech in which Hitler is talking about, and therefore we will do such and so to the Jews. Hitler, by the way, is talking about Poland at the time, and it is to prepare his generals for the attack on Poland. Indeed, one of the interesting features of the attack on Poland in 1939, in distinction from the attack on Soviet Russia in 1941, is that it was not accompanied with a great anti-Semitic campaign. Indeed, the Nazis, who first took charge of occupied Poland, didn't know what to do with the Jews they found, because they didn't have the instructions. Indeed, the Nazi Party's directions and the direction of the German government was, both before and after the conquest of Poland, not to get hold of all the Jews that they could in order that they be murdered, but rather to expel the Jews, to facilitate their emigration. And the Nazis were still encouraging the Jews to emigrate from Europe. When I first studied their policy in detail in the summer of 1940, and even a year later in the summer of 1941, though it begins to end then. The Nazis in charge of France, I found, encouraged the French government authorities to facilitate the immigration of Jews wherever they had visas, whether it be to South America, whether it be to Morocco, whether it be to Spain or wherever. In short, the Nazis wanted to see Europe rid of its Jews, and this seems largely what they meant by the final solution, or the Gesamtlösung, or the Entlösung, or whatever they discuss. Since, if you want to murder each and every Jew that you can get your hands on, you obviously don't want that Jew to go to Brazil. Now, at the same time, the planning for, in my view, and this is a matter I say in parentheses, that is likely to be under continuing debate, since when Hitler talked about such matters, he spoke and he didn't write down his intentions the way Winston Churchill did. Churchill plotted his objectives in elaborate detail on paper, and we can study and follow very closely what he had in mind. Hitler talked. It seems to many, I would even venture to say the majority of historians who have gone over this ground, that the beginning of the planning or some would say the beginning of the fighting for Operation Barbarossa is decisive, because it is at this point that murder begins to crowd out any possible alternative solution as the way of getting rid of the Jews. Planning begins in March of 1941. Planning, as we know, will involve the Einsatzgruppen and the shooting down of hundreds of thousands and eventually several million Jews. As well, the planning elaborated to an assault not just on the Jews of the Soviet Union and of Eastern Europe that the Nazis were then busy, the demographic map of which the Nazis were then reordering, but Western Europe as well. Belgium, Holland, Ireland, Great Britain. The Nazis planned to get their hands even on those Jews. To my mind, this is an important pivot, an important turning point. And the final solution begins to take on an exclusively murderous character. Up to that point, as far as I can see, the Nazis envisioned a variety of ways of accomplishing their goal, the Hitlerian defined goal of ridding Europe of its Jews. Madagascar was one scheme, and the Nazis, in all likelihood, took their Madagascar plan seriously. Lublin, there might be a reservation for Jews in the Lublin district of Poland. In 1939, in a period of a few weeks, such a program was already underway, though it was in all likelihood seen as a temporary solution pending the forcing off of ever larger numbers of Jews to the east. The Nazis always had in mind murder, but murder did not take on this comprehensive character that we associate with the final solution, in my view at least, until the year 1941. So I believe it evolved. It evolved. Now, it is possible that Hitler himself may have had some objective lurking in his imagination. We will never know for certain. But it is, again, in my view, in the course of the year 1941, and only then, that this program emerged as Nazi policy.
I can accept that the practice as the beginning of the Polish campaign and preparations for and in Barbarossa changes considerably. Where I have a problem with the evolution, not with the evolution itself, but with the dating of where the turning point is with a series of meetings with his Amtschefs and with the heads of the Einsatzgruppen that Heydrich has during the Polish campaign, and where Lublin and other things are discussed. But all of those things are discussed, and besides that, the end seal. The end goal is mentioned, and nobody, including Christopher Browning, has answered for me what that end seal was.
Yes, well, you've put your finger on a crucial problem. You see, the Nazis talk about a final goal, an end seal. Entlosung is mentioned in June 1941 in the form of a territorial final solution. And you see, the problem of interpretation is concerned with putting content into this end seal. I again encountered for France occupation officials saying, what are we doing with these Jews? What's behind all of this? What are we about? They say to one another, they ask one another in 1940, 1941. And the answer is that the Fuhrer will define the final goal, and interestingly, they say in 1940, and again in 1941, when the war is over. When the war is over. And Christopher Browning quotes an official in the German Foreign Office at the Jewish desk who says quite remarkably towards the end of 1941, in what I think confirms Browning's sense of the reversal that occurs about the middle of that year, that we must now hurry up with the final solution, which is a systematic European-wide mass murder, because the Fuhrer has now determined that we're going to finish it before the war is over. In other words, in the course of the Soviet campaign, the whole optic changes. No longer is it to be put off, it's now to be speeded up and to be undertaken so long as the war continues. And the war is then truly seen as the cover for the final solution. Now, I don't want to go too far into detail on this issue, because historians do differ on the question of timing, as you properly say. The range of difference, however, is across a matter of months. And I don't know of a wide body of historical opinion that reads back into the 1920s, for example, a perception of European-wide mass murder or universal mass murder. It is an evolutionary process, and depending on which historian you choose, the timing will be pinned down at different points. I hope I fairly reflect what I think is a wide body of opinion, that the campaign in Russia is crucial. There are dissenters, but I would say a cluster of historians at least have seen either the preparation of that war or the early conduct of it as central for the movement of the final solution into a clear, determined goal of European-wide mass murder.
And follow that up. And using your proper suggestion that we look at these things in a historical context. I don't care what other people are saying. I'm looking at Reinhard Heydrich, the man charged with the final solution, the man whose people would begin it, who would organize the administration, the interagency administration. And he's holding a series of meetings. They are not prepared in Poland for all these Jews, but they're encountering them. And they talk about all of the other things, including expulsion. But they also talk about an end goal. And what is the end goal if it isn't expulsion? What's left? And that is why I have the problem of saying that, at least in Heydrich's mind, I'd even argue that in 1938, Heydrich already looked ahead.
Well, look,
Final solution. So at least in one of the key actors' minds, it's there earlier.
look,
And the planning is there.
Well, now on the planning issue, we do have a problem, I think. I mean, you're familiar with Christopher Browning's look at the ghettos of Eastern Europe. And indeed, the failure to communicate a plan, a murderous plan, to a significant number of very high-ranking Nazis is, to my mind, a question of significance. I mean, what are they waiting for? Poland is conquered in September of 1939. Are they waiting for the Russian campaign? Well, it is also supposed to be over in a very short period of time. The Nazis anticipated that that campaign, begun in June, would be over within about 8 weeks. What are they waiting for? Well, high-ranking Nazis, those in charge, the Hoher SS und Polizeiführer in areas of the Generalgouvernement of Poland, for example, the highest-ranking Nazi police authorities, in the absence of any direction from Berlin, start to debate what to do with the Jews. Some want to see the Jews herded into ghettos and allowed to die off by hunger and disease. Others think that this is absurd, damaging to the war effort. The Jews should be put to work. Browning has discovered a debate among high-ranking Nazi officials. Heydrich doesn't interfere in this debate. Hitler doesn't interfere in this debate. They're waiting for the Führer's decision. The Führer, as we know, could set such things in motion. He didn't. And it's a puzzle why he didn't. No one has found the key to that puzzle. And it is at least possible, it is at least plausible, it seems to me, that the highest-ranking Nazi himself had not himself a clear idea of what was to be done. Uwe Dietrich Adam, the late Adam, a German historian, once believed that what Hitler probably had in mind was forcing the Jews across a prostrate Soviet Union that would be defeated very quickly in the summer of 1941. Then the Jews would be driven off further to the east. But where are the plans for that? Browning has properly criticized Adam. Where are the plans for it? We don't have those plans. We don't have those plans for the shipping of vast numbers of European Jews to the east. So it is a puzzle. I think it is at least a plausible explanation that Hitler himself had murderous objectives, but had not the comprehensive European-wide murderous project in mind. Remember, the project that would involve the Jews of Ireland as well as the Jews of Greece and the Jews of Poland and Eastern Europe. All of them. When did the Nazis determine that they would all have to be swept up? You see, that's the problem. That's the question that I ask. Well, look, this isn't the only issue that involves the application of historical context, but it's one of the most troublesome. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, I'm not going to sound so academical, which I'm not. I'm just a survivor. And I was listening to this presentation, which was quite impressive from the historical point of view. I'll just bring it down sort of to my level, which is everyday life, which I can still not make peace with myself to answer the question. Hitler had an idea to do away with Jews. Well, he was a madman who wanted to overtake the world and do away with us. Why in the world did it took such an immense hold between the average citizens? What in the world have I done that I deserve this for my country, which I like? Where does this deep anti-Semitism come to the average person? Why?
You know, look, you've asked a profound question. May I say that the historian can only do so much? But let me nevertheless say this, and let me say as well that your question, far from bringing the issue down to a level that is insufficiently elevated, on the contrary, raises the most profound, deepest of problems. What I tried to suggest was that the fantasies themselves, however, may not be so bizarre. What is so troubling and what is so frightening and what is unprecedented is the implementation of these fantasies. How could these fantasies actually be implemented, and implemented on a global stage? And you referred quite properly to the opinion of the world at large and to the sensibility of what we now know to be thousands of persons involved at various levels in again, what Hilberg calls the machinery of destruction. If I could sum up one of the points that I tried to make about public opinion, it would be that the closer we look at this apparatus, the closer we look, for example, as Claude Lanzmann did at the Polish trainmen that drove the trains that carried the Jews to the death camps. The closer we look at that huge apparatus that Hilberg described so pioneeringly in 1961 or 62, the more we see people who are really not necessarily at all motivated by some deep anti-Semitic vocation. They're quite ordinary careerist individuals. Mentioned Christopher Browning. He looked at the Jewish desk of the German Foreign Office, a special bureau, at the head of which he did not find a raving anti-Semite. You could find raving anti-Semites, but the far more, and Heydrich, of course, is one of them, but along with the Heydrichs of that world were so many much more ordinary people. Again, I looked most closely at France, a country the complicity of which in the final solution we now know a good deal about and has become a matter of public record and public discussion. There were anti-Semitic activists in France, but when Bob Paxton and I looked at the prefect's reports on public opinion, far more important to permit the operation of this machinery, in my view, were the ordinary blinkered French bureaucrats, the people who stamped the documents, who processed the papers, who permitted this whole apparatus to go on. The French police, for example, crucial in the operation of the deportations from France. Anti-Semites? Yes, but the most anti-Semitic among the French joined the milice that in the final days of the occupation fought against the French police. You know, again, we encounter people who are far more like ourselves. And the power of indifference, whether it's the indifference of the French public at large or the French bureaucracy, whether it's the indifference of the large numbers of ordinary Germans that the British historian Ian Kershaw has studied, or whether it's the indifference of British Foreign Office officials, some of whom are anti-Semitic, but only just so much, most of whom are spurning the Poles and the Czechs when they ask for some kind of intervention as well. You know, it's this indifference that, to my mind, let me put it this way, deserves to be studied along with the anti-Semitic dynamic at work in Europe. The two have to be studied together. I am not proposing that one supplant the other, but I would say that our emphasis has been on the demonic, you see. And we need to continue to study that, but what makes the demonic work is this other element, and I want to bring that to the subject as well.
May I clarify? What makes the demonic work, and you said average people like me and you, maybe it's the fault of the society that it affects the average people. Now I'm not talking again from the historical point of view. When you mention Denmark, I am a small little way interviewing people. I want to find out what makes it tick, why this country acted like this. And I found out that in Denmark such a thing doesn't exist such anymore. But very little anti-Semitism in Denmark even before the war. The country is not a religious country. How much this has to do with it? I don't know. I pondered those things to myself. I just gave a talk several days ago in one of the colleges here in this vicinity, down to the average day life, average people. And he says like this. This is kind of, why did God this to the Jews? Now, if he would tell me why it happened, then he have lots of interpretation, many of which you just pointed out right here. But when he tells me that God did it, then it's my fault. Whatever I didn't accept is how it did.
Madam,
And we are very religious people here. Then whose fault is it? Is it not the society's fault that we have to educate the average person who's thinking about me? This is not hysterical person. And I could cite you more examples. Like I said, I do speak, I talk, and I get a lot of feedback. This is not the only one. Oh, then they like me. I have had a minister writing me a letter because he wants to preach about me. Obviously, he likes me. I'm a very nice Christian. He knows I'm Jewish, I told him. But nevertheless, this is not the first time it happened to me. In this Christian mom, there's no, and I told her this evening in front of several hundred people in the church, and I told them about this incident. I said, can you accept me, let alone a Jewish? I know it's very hard for you to bring this word across your mouth, a nice Jews. Forget about it. Can you accept me as a person? Do I have a place in your mind as a person? But they tell me I am a good Christian. And he wants to preach about me. And it's not the first time it happened. So something is wrong somewhere besides the historical points of view, which are very valid. So there's more to it. Because if a madman comes along and it takes hold that easily, whose fault is it?
well, I think we can all agree with you that there's quite a bit that's wrong.
I'd like to ask,
Excuse me, anyone else before we return to this gentleman?
you were alluding to Hitler's predisposition as to his intent. Hitler wrote his Mein Kampf, and then when the beer push came along in 1923, General von Ludendorff, great general hero of World War I, who was probably as anti-Semitic as anyone publicly could have been at that time, joined Hitler's forces in the push. He was Hitler's mentor until his death. I think it was 1938. If that wasn't enough to get Hitler's thoughts towards the final solution, and it'd be a murderous one, I don't know how we can justify it any other way.
Well, I'm sure we'd all agree that justification is not what anyone's objective. Yes, sir.
If I may go back to the historical perspective for a minute, you listed three elements which I'll culminate with. One was your view that individual function, the individual role of Hitler in the whole process is important. The second one, the concept existed, the fantasy existed all the time. Now, would that lead me to a conclusion that the only evolutional aspect of the development is that of technology? Is that the distinction between today's realization of the fantasy and the past existence of the fantasies which were never realized? And how does that agree with the individual role?
No. Technology is important. The technology which is not there in 1915 when the Turks were engaged in a murderous attack on the Armenians. Technology is crucial, and the Nazis were very preoccupied with technology, as we know. Technology, however, and organization, and this is the human element. It took the Nazis considerable effort to build up a European-wide apparatus, and to study this apparatus in such a wide variety of countries is really is an effort that sees how the Nazis so remarkably manipulated quite different societies with the object of murdering the Jews who lived in each one of these societies. How the Nazis approached Antonescu in Poland, Horthy in Hungary, Pétain in France, how the Nazis dealt with the Italians on the question, what the Nazis did in Holland, in Belgium, wherever they were. Working with relatively few Nazi, working with a very small apparatus that was involved full-time in the tracking down and deportation of Jews. The Nazis put this machinery together, and Hilberg's great book was the first to describe, to my mind, the interlocking of this apparatus, which he called a machinery, on a European scale. So that was something that took a very considerable effort. And it involved the manipulation of occupied peoples and governments. It involved the manipulation of public opinion. It involved the use of the judiciary. It involved the use of local police. It involved the economic apparatuses and so forth. It all was interwoven and interlocked. So that is the novelty of the final solution, if you like. I mean, but before the Nazis, you have murderous regimes that sent large numbers of soldiers to murder people. But to organize this on a European scale, this was something that only the Nazis had undertaken.
We Southerners have a quaint and arcane tradition in which the host does not get into a debate with his guest. Let me debate Chris Browning a little bit since he's not here, and sort of get you off the hook, I think, on a couple of points by suggesting that among the very provocative and I think useful suggestions that you've made, particularly for the historian, that there are other approaches that are useful too, one of which is the quality that I call executive instinct on the part particularly of those in the radical inner circle around Hitler who picked up on dinner table conversation, on implicit and explicit things that he said about policy, whatnot, particularly Heydrich, and to suggest that the process of moving the evolution of anti-Jewish policy from deprivation, discrimination, and forced immigration up until 1938 to deportation and extermination in 1940 and 41 involves a process not unlike the fuel rods in the reactor core causing the water to boil. And the term final solution is not really used in June of 41, it's used in June of 40 in the letter that Heydrich writes to Ribbentrop immediately after the armistice.
Did I say 41 yet?
In which he finds out that Ribbentrop has been talking to Ciano about anti-Jewish measures, and to put the foreign minister on notice that I'm reading this in the context in which I've read it before, to put the foreign minister on notice that he's traducing into what is already Heydrich's territory. He says that nothing should be done without him being consulted, and that the question no longer really can be solved by immigration, that what is really called for is a territorial final solution. And there's a very important small word underlined in that letter in which Heydrich alludes to the fact that there are currently, that is as of June 24th, 1940, several million Jews under German control. The implication being that there are going to be more in the future under German control, which I interpret to be an allusion to the Soviet Union. Further, I think the document that Richard Brightman has discovered of the the minutes of the conference in the in the propaganda ministry in March of 41, March 3rd, 1941, in which Eichmann was a participant, and Eichmann, this is a conference on the question of the deportation of the Berlin Jews. Eichmann makes very clear reference to comprehensive proposals that Heydrich had submitted to Hitler 8 weeks earlier, which would have been January 41, for a total solution to the Jewish question in Europe, which cannot be implemented at the moment because of the transport and logistical difficulties in the government general of Poland, suggests to me, at least, that the process of planning may have occurred earlier and may even antedate the process of planning for the Einsatzgruppen, or that the two may be one and the same thing. Further, one other thing, the day my man got it, the day Gavas and Kubchak killed Heydrich, or wounded him, and he subsequently died, as you may know, he was on his way to Rastenburg from Prague to make a final report on his tenure as Reich Protector in Bohemian Moravia, and to receive a new appointment, at least upon the recommendation of Himmler and Bormann, to go to France to replace the military governor there, with whom Heydrich and Himmler had built a very careful case over the preceding 6 months as to the military ineptitude in not only running the occupied portion of France, but in dealing with Vichy too.
This is Stulpnagel.
Yes.
Heinrich von Stulpnagel. Look, ladies and gentlemen, this is a glimpse into the workshop, if you like, of the historian, and you're able to peer over Charlie Sidner's shoulder and see the work table in which these various documents are put out. And if our friend Chris Browning were here, he would say, aha, but you might see this other document. And the range of interpretation, I would say, by the way, is narrowing.
Yes.
It's narrowing. When several German historians struck the first of what we often call now the functionalist position, struck the first pegs in that position, it was quite far away from the other interpretation that stressed extensive, clear pre-planning for the final solution. We're coming together on this, and in a way, the kinds of questions that we ask are starting to alter. I don't want to get more deeply than we already have been, or to look more closely at the historian's work table, but let me mention one general thing to reinforce what you said. I think that to some degree we are seeing the way that the Nazis made decisions about the Jews as being not unrelated to the way the Nazis made decisions about other things.
Precisely.
Foreign policy, for example. Did Hitler plan war in 1939? And what kind of war did he plan in 1939? And so on. The way executive instinct proceeded, that is, people picking up strong hints from Hitler when he wanted to give those hints, we see that in all sorts of areas in which, by the way, Hitler's procrastination, which was legendary, could extend over an area that everyone knew was close to his heart, and yet he refused to make a decision and allowed others to propose solutions to him, taking their signals from what they knew to be his ideological imperatives. In any event, we see this kind of decision-making with the final solution as well. And I don't know if it is really so important, indeed I think it is probably not so important, to cleave to a line of thought that was articulated a long time ago, that everything that Hitler did towards against the Jews was carefully worked out at a very early point in his career, that somehow it is any less ghastly for having evolved in particular contexts, though we differ as to what those contexts were. I don't know if it is significantly, well, I think we can learn a lot simply by trying to ponder the process and trying to extend our range of investigation to compare Hitler's style in other spheres of activity. Just as we should look, for example, at Allied decision makers. When they say no to the Jews about the bombing of Auschwitz in the summer of 1944, let us also see them saying no to the Poles or to the Czechs after the massacres at Lidice in response to the assassination of Heydrich. The Czechs went to the British and wanted the British to bomb certain German cities in retaliation for the massacres at Lidice. Now, the circumstances weren't quite the same as when Weissmandl made his plea in the summer of 1944, but they're not so wildly different either. And you can see the same mindset at work, the same blinkered, narrow, bureaucratic, unimaginative processes at work. See, I do think that we have tended to block our efforts to understand much of this terrible history by assuming too much power, if I could put it this way, paradoxically, too much power to anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism was at work, but it wasn't the only thing at work. Among those other things at work were aspects of life perhaps much more familiar to us than we might care to admit, and with much more destructive capacity than we might care to admit. So, along with Hitler's terrible obsessions, to return to this, so Hitler's procrastination and Hitler's inclination to play some of his leading followers off against each other and to reward the ideologically most zealous, such as Heydrich. This played a role as well. And in the end, we must try to put the whole package together. That's the challenge to us. And when we do so, I think the lessons are still there. They're not quite the same lessons as those people have drawn from looking at the exclusively anti-Semitic dynamics of the matter. There are other lessons, but let's study those as well. Yes, sir.
I have a question. There have been studies made, and it came to the conclusion that a large amount of the most cruel guards and executioners came from well-educated Germans. Why?
Well, I'm not sure that I know. Certainly, I don't know the answer to that one, and it's the premise that I have some trouble with. That there were very well-educated officers in the Einsatzgruppen. Of that, there is now no doubt. I mean, that has been established for some time. It was mentioned at Nuremberg. That to refer to a book written by an Israeli historian, Bartov, on the campaign in Russia, that there were a significantly high number of quite well-educated junior officers in the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, and that these officers contributed substantially to what Bartov calls the barbarization of war in the Soviet Union. Of that, too, there seems no doubt. And according to Bartov, at least, the key is the intense ideological indoctrination that these junior officers received, and their willingness to communicate orders such as the Kommissarbefehl that involved massive criminality of the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. This is his explanation. There is a problem here, but I am not sure that we're very far at all in solving it, and I'm not even sure that we know enough about the distribution of, or the propensity of highly educated people to be complicit in Nazi crimes, or whether there was a disproportionate inclination. I simply don't know. Yes.
I would like to ask you, I understand that this is a part of history. Would you please help me understand what caused it, what forces behind it? It runs around in Europe like a wildfire, that they all caught some kind of a demonic thought. Or are the demons really around? Or what? How can you understand what?
By the way, you have used, unintentionally I'm sure, but I think we all have used it at one time or another, a biological analogy that murderous anti-Semitism is something you catch like a virus, and it's going around. I'm not sure that that analogy helps us so much. If I look, you've asked the most profound of questions. I'm trying to add to the many explanations that have been offered that there is an enormously destructive power of indifference. That with a society that is indifference, and I think this is, if you like, a moral undercurrent in what I'm suggesting this evening, that there is that with a climate of indifference in a modern technological society, you can see enormous destruction done. Let me leave it at that. We can all find our examples, imagine our instances. The destructive power of indifference should be added to this murderous anti-Semitism, which, however it's communicated, and I suspect it doesn't help so much to think of it as being communicated as with a kind of virus. I think, as the gentleman's question last suggested, it is communicated through indoctrination at least as thoroughly and effectively. Look, let me indicate yet another puzzle. I'm somewhat surprised that no one has picked it up, given what I take is the understandable direction of a number of questions. But the churches, the Catholic Church and the Holocaust, frequently a topic for substantial debate and discussion. We've mentioned two Catholic societies tonight, Italy and Poland, both deeply Catholic societies. In Poland, a very high degree of anti-Semitism. In Italy, a country seemingly inoculated against much of European anti-Semitism. What explains the difference between the two? It's a problem. I have tried very briefly to suggest that there are concrete historical circumstances in each of these societies that enter the equation and that prove decisive. In the case of Italy, its geopolitical circumstances, its experience with the Jews, and so on. In the case of Poland, the reverse, you see. So my plea in conclusion, and it really is the conclusion, is that we should all test ourselves to broaden our range of explanations of these matters, to try to extend our investigation at least, even if only to reject certain avenues of explanation and understanding, and not to feel locked into any explanatory mode, because as you and many others this evening have properly underscored, it is the deepest and most profound of problems, all the more reason why we shouldn't be satisfied with neat and highly circumscribed answers. And with that, I see I have
Thank you, Professor Marrus. May I suggest in conclusion, since our time is long past up, that those of you who have asked questions tonight will find in much more detail many of the answers you are seeking in the pages of this volume, which both Walter LaCour and Yehuda Bauer have called by far the most satisfactory and distinguished volume of introduction to the general subject of the Holocaust. It is a work of value for the general student and a source book of unparalleled interest and value for the specialist as well. The Holocaust from History, and Professor Marrus, thank you very much for being with us tonight. Thank you very much.